On the 24th of June 1995, Christine Susan Munro was a 37-year-old nurse, mother of 4 children, and a Redding, California resident. On this day, she decided to go for a jog on the south side of Sacramento River Trail. As she was jogging, she was suddenly confronted with a stranger who started stabbing her with a knife. During this time, she started defending herself and tried to fight back. She managed to scratch the offender, but was overwhelmed and soon passed away from her injuries. Her lifeless body was discovered and police were contacted. When they arrived, evidence was collected from the crime scene. When the news of the attack broke, it shocked the entire community. Investigators conducted countless interviews and followed up on many leads. However, the case eventually went cold. Then in 1997, a man falsely confessed to taking Munro's life. This was ignored because his confession lacked detail and didn't match the evidence at the crime scene. Then in late 2019, the case was reopened with the hope that the physical evidence could be analysed using modern DNA technology. In January of 2020, Munro's fingernail scrapings were sent to a forensic lab for analysis, and in June of 2020, the authorities received a notification of a possible match through the CODIS DNA database. The evidence matched the profile of 42-year-old James Watkins of Texas as a suspect. He would have been 17 years old at the time of the crime. Watkins was currently serving a 14-year sentence for robbery in a state prison in Texas. Detectives started looking into Watkins' movements at the time of Munro's attack and found that he had moved from Texas to Redding in early 1995 to live with his aunt and uncle. Before he moved back to Texas in fall of 1997, he had been contacted by the Redding Police Department 8 times. Those contacts included an arrest on suspicions of shoplifting and unlawful camping. While in Texas, he had been arrested and charged with multiple crimes, including indecent assault, burglary, escape and bank robbery. Watkins has spent a significant portion of his life in jail. In August of 2020, the Redding Police Department detectives flew to Texas to interview Watkins. With the assistance of the Texas Rangers, a search warrant was issued for Watkins' DNA and obtained a sample from him. Upon their return, detectives transferred the Watkins DNA sample to the California Department of Justice Redding Lab. Within a few weeks, the analysis confirmed that the original CODIS hit matched the evidence from the crime scene. A warrant for Watkins' arrest was granted on the 22nd of October 2020, and he faces charges for taking Munro's life, kidnapping, and indecent assault. The authorities transferred Watkins from Texas to Redding and continued interviewing him on the 13th of November 2020, where authorities said he hadn't provided a motive. He's currently housed in the Shasta County Prison without bail. He's pending sentencing and his first court appearance is due next week. If convicted, Watkins will be spared his life because he was a juvenile at the time of the crime, but he faces the prospect of life in jail without the possibility of parole. Lisa, who's one of Munro's daughters, thanked the authorities for their work on the case. Not a single day goes by that I don't think about the day my mum's life was taken. She loved the river trail, and I take comfort knowing that she passed away in a place that she loved so much. Thank you, all of you. Sherry Black was a 64-year-old grandmother who was loved by everyone in her community. She operated a book business with her husband Earl, which was also their home in South Salt Lake in Utah. They sold used and rare books, and her husband crafted pool tables and custom knives. At around 1:40 p.m. on the 30th of November 2010, Earl found Sherry's lifeless body inside their business. She had been beaten, stabbed 20 times, and also been violated. The authorities were contacted and arrived at the scene. Evidence was collected which included blood, a belt, palm and fingerprints. The belt was an Armani brand with a waist measurement of approximately 36 to 38 inches and had a sticker on the back of the buckle with the number 323. DNA testing determined that the blood came from a male. The DNA was run through a national criminal database, but no match was found. Despite spending exhaustive hours of investigation, there were no suspects or persons of interest named, and the case went cold. In December of 2016, The authorities, along with the assistance of Parabon, put the evidence through the DNA phenotyping process that predicts a person's physical appearance and ancestry. Genetic genealogy was then used, where the information was uploaded to public ancestry websites, creating family trees, and they narrowed their suspect down to 29-year-old Adam Durborough. On the 7th of October 2020, DNA was secretly obtained from Adam from traces of his DNA left in public places, which was submitted to a forensic lab, and a match to the DNA at the crime scene was made. On the 8th of October 2020, he was arrested at his Orem home without incident. He was questioned and confessed to taking Sherry's life, but did not provide a motive for the crime. The fact that Adam was adopted made the arrest process even more challenging than usual. The police had to run through adoption records and interview possible family members before finally being able to narrow it down to him. He was one of a dozen children that were adopted. The investigators were tight-lipped about the details of the matter, since it's still in its early stages of the arrest. Adam's birth mother lived about a mile away from Sherry's bookstore in 2010, and he may have been familiar with the business. He's been held at the Salt Lake County Jail without bail for taking Sherry's life, and is yet to be sentenced. Sherry's family released a statement that said, "While this 10-year period has been difficult, we've been able to feel at peace and comfort, knowing that other cases are being solved with the use of new forensic tools." On Saturday, the 8th of August 1998, an 11-year-old Dutch boy named Nicky Verstappen joined 36 other kids on a bus trip to Limburg in the Netherlands for a summer camp. At 5:30 in the morning on the 10th of August, Nicky was last seen in his sleeping bag by a tent mate. Later that morning, he was no longer in his sleeping bag, and only his shoes were still in the tent. The following day, he was reported missing, and the authorities, along with the volunteers, conducted an extensive search for him. At 9 p.m, his lifeless, partially disrobed body was discovered in a woodland 3/4 of a mile away from the camp. He was bare from the waist up, and his body showed signs that he had possibly been violated. Evidence was collected at the crime scene, including a cigarette and tissue, which were found near his body, as well as foreign DNA that had been found in Nicky's underwear. From this DNA, a profile of the suspect was created, but there were no hits in the DNA database that could identify the suspect. A military police officer had seen a man riding a bike in the dark hours after Nicky's body had been found. He was twice asked for his name and twice questioned by police, but was never identified as a suspect and was believed to have been a passerby at the time. 2 witnesses later came forward and said they saw a man riding his bike with a boy on the back near the camp on the night of the attack. Although several witnesses were identified and questioned, an extensive investigation was undertaken, and the case remained unsolved for decades. In January of 2018, a DNA profiling exercise was rolled out, testing tens of thousands of Limburg residents. On the 22nd of August 2018, it was announced using a relative's DNA submitted that they were able to narrow their search and identify the suspect to be 55-year-old Joes Brecht. Brecht, however, was reported missing by his family in April of 2018 after he failed to respond to a request for his DNA sample. Instead, they were able to extract a sample of his DNA from one of his personal items after he was reported missing to verify the match. 27 traces of DNA on Nicky's body and clothing matched his profile. The development led to a Europe-wide search for Brecht. He was tracked down to a remote area outside Barcelona, where he lived in the wild in the tent. He was arrested on the 26th of August 2018 and extradited to the Netherlands on the 6th of September 2018 and has been held in custody ever since. Who would have been 35 at the time of the offence, had once worked at a kindergarten. He has a history of violating children and is known to have lived near the area at the time of the attack. His trial began on the 28th of September 2020 and lasted 3 weeks. He pleaded not guilty on all accusations. He said that on the 11th of August 1998, hours before Nicky's body was found by the search party, he was walking close to the edge of a forest and he saw something in the distance. Out of curiosity, he went closer to have a look and found the body. He said his DNA was found on the body because he had checked for signs of life, brushed leaves off the body, and then left. Brecht said he had no idea how his DNA ended up on the underwear. He explained that he never reported his body missing to the authorities because he was worried they might accuse him of Nicky's passing because of his criminal history. On the 20th of November 2020, Brett was found guilty of violating Nicky, but there was insufficient evidence to show he intentionally took Nicky's life. Although he pushed Nicky to the ground and covered his mouth and made him suffocate while he committed his lewd act, he was not found guilty of taking his life. He received a 12-year jail sentence for this crime and another 6 months for possession of provocative indecent child imagery. On the 21st of March 1990, Sharon Gill was a 42-year-old woman who had moved into Deep Creek, Florida home with her 18-year-old daughter Christy. Her husband Percy was a preacher and was in Detroit finishing up some work at the time before joining his family. Since they had just moved there, they had a crew of workers completing some landscaping around their home. On this day, Christy had returned home from school, and as she entered the home, she turned left and noticed blood all over the wall, along with the mother's lifeless body who had been stabbed 39 times. The authorities were contacted and arrived at the crime scene and collected evidence. Despite extensive investigation into the matter, the case went cold. On the 10th of July in the year 2000, an 86-year-old retired nurse Elizabeth Sheila, who lived alone, had her life taken while inside a Newark apartment. She had been stabbed 7 times in the throat and upper chest, and money was taken from her. Police arrived and evidence was collected from the crime scene. The DNA was entered into the CODIS DNA database. However, there were no hits and the case went cold. On the 16th of April 2003, in Columbus, Ohio, a man by the name of Roland Davis was arrested after severely assaulting a street worker that he picked up while working in an ice cream truck. The woman managed to escape and reported the incident to authorities. When police picked Davis up that day, the woman's blood was all over his pants. The pants were stained with her blood as he continued to work his shift inside the ice cream truck. DNA was collected from Davis and he was later released. It was discovered that Davis's DNA matched the crime scene of Elizabeth Sheila after it was sent to the FBI DNA database for analysis. Davis worked as a cab driver back then and had driven Sheila around a number of times and knew that she kept large amounts of cash in her bedroom before he took her life and fled the scene. Davis was arrested in April of 2004. Davis, who was born in 1952, was found guilty of taking Sheila's life, and he was jailed at the Chillicothe Correctional Institution to later have his life taken. More recently, detectives in the Florida Cold Case Unit reopened Sharon Gill's case and collaborated with a number of law enforcement agencies, including the Newark Division of Police, in their investigation. Evidence that was collected at the crime scene of Gill was sent to a forensic lab to analyse the DNA. After receiving confirmation from the lab, it was announced on the 23rd of November 2020 that the DNA of Davis was matched to the DNA found at the crime scene of Gill. Davis, who's now 68, would have been 37 years old at the time, and it was discovered that he was working for a landscape company that Gill hired. Cold Case Detective Mike Vogel said, "Of course David denied being in the victim's home where the DNA was found. He also said that Davis had no other motive other than he's probably a psychopath." State Attorney Dan Feinberg said, "The new technology allowed this case to be solved." Krista said she's grateful the detectives never gave up. Charges are anticipated to be filed early in 2021. However, Davis has already been sentenced to have his life ended as a result of the Sheila attack. On the 6th of May 1997, a 41-year-old woman was attacked while she was heading home from work in the Bay Area Rapid Transport region in Union City, California. As she was walking, she was dragged to a secluded area in a nearby field where she was indecently assaulted. After the authorities were alerted to the crime, they were able to obtain a sample of the suspect's DNA from the victim's clothing. On the 7th of September 1997, a second incident occurred about 15 miles from the initial attack. A 22-year-old woman was ambushed and violated while she was going for an evening walk around Livermore High School. The local police were notified and were able to obtain a DNA sample from the crime scene. The DNA collected from both attacks were tested and found to be matched for one another, which meant the same person committed both crimes. The samples were uploaded to the CODIS DNA database. However, there wasn't a hit at the time, and the assailant's identity remained unknown. In July of 2019, investigators sent the DNA samples to a crime lab. Using genetic genealogy, they were able to track down the DNA of relatives uploaded in publicly available ancestry websites and narrow their search to identify 59-year-old Gregory Vien as the suspect. Detectives focused their attention on Vien and monitored his movements. After watching Vien dispose of a plastic ice cream spoon he had used, they retrieved it and were able to obtain a sample of his DNA, verifying him as the attacker in both crimes. A warrant for his arrest for 2 indecent assault charges was issued on the 4th of November 2019. He was arrested the following day at his home at 100 Cameo Drive in Livermore, and he was held in Santa Rita Jail and pleaded not guilty. In April of 2020, Vien was released by the court due to COVID-19 concerns over the objection of the District Attorney's Office and police. He was instructed to wear an ankle bracelet to monitor his movements. He was told not to leave his home until his next court appearance. His bail was reduced from $2.5 million to $0. He was also suspected to have been involved in 3 other separate attacks in the area as well. On the 12th of November 2020, a preliminary hearing began where both victims testified in court with the defendant and his attorney present. The following day, the second victim was scheduled to complete her testimony when the court received news that Vien was hospitalised. He attempted to take his own life by shooting himself several times with a nail gun. A week later, on the 19th of November, Vien passed away from self-inflicted injuries. With the defendant no longer alive, the case was dismissed. Alameda County District Attorney Nancy O'Malley said, "The survivors of these assaults showed great courage in coming to court to face the man who attacked and terrorised them 23 years ago. Both women lived for all these years without knowing who assaulted her or seeing him brought to justice. The police agencies never stopped investigating these heinous crimes in order to keep the victims and communities of Livermore and Union City safe. We applaud their dedication, tenacity, and excellent investigative work that led to the arrest and charges against Gregory Vien." On the 27th of May 1987, Auburn High School graduate Tammy Tracey was a 19-year-old Rockford, Illinois resident. She enjoyed sports, particularly golf and baseball. It was a pleasant day, and she'd just been fishing with her sister-in-law, whom had to leave to go to work. Tammy was last seen at Searles Park, not far from her home, waxing a 2-door black 1979 Oldsmobile car after giving it a wash. Later that evening, she was due to meet a family member at Ingersoll's golf course, but failed to show up. When she didn't return home the following day, her mother Linda Tracey became concerned and reported her missing. The car was found abandoned at the park, and it was locked. There was no signs of a struggle, and she was nowhere to be seen. An extensive search began for her, but it turned up nothing. Then almost a year later, on the 15th of April 1988, a hiker discovered skeletal remains at the Sugar River Forest Preserve in Durand, Illinois. An autopsy showed that she'd been shot in the head and stabbed in the chest with an ice pick. For decades, the case frustrated investigators, and for years they said they were close to being able to make an arrest. Earlier in 2020, authorities thought they knew who took Tammy's life, but they were working together to gather the evidence needed to prove it. The Tracey family started putting billboards up as recently as May 2020, hoping to obtain new information on the crime. The case was cracked on the 19th of November 2020 when new evidence in the case led the authorities to identify 64-year-old Rockford resident Jesse Smith as the suspect. He was spotted driving an 18-wheeler in Worth County and followed into Clark Avenue into Albany in southwest Georgia when he was arrested for taking Tammy's life. The authorities were tight-lipped about the motive of the crime and were scant on details about the evidence used that led to the arrest, except to say that Smith lived in the area at the time of the attack and was known by Tammy's family. In the afternoon on the 19th of November 2020, Smith was taken into custody in Albany, Georgia, on a $5 million bond and will be sent to Illinois to face the charges. Rockford Police Chief Dan O'Shea said, "It's heartbreaking. One of the first people I met when I came to Rockford almost 5 years ago was Linda Tracey, Tammy's mum. The Tracey family can now get closure and continue to get closure as the case moves through the court." Linda said there was always going to be somebody she knew, and she just wouldn't go with anybody. She just wouldn't. I have to see this person punished and know why he did it before it's too late. On the morning of the 20th of September 2004, Rebekah Gould was a 22-year-old student from Northwest Arkansas Community College in Fayetteville. She dropped her boyfriend off at work at Sonic Restaurant and was last seen alive at a convenience store in Melbourne. She had left that weekend to visit friends in Vien, a small town south of Melbourne on the White River, and later failed to return to a junior college where she was supposed to meet up with her sister, but she never showed up and was reported missing. A search of the home which she'd been staying at during the time away showed signs of a struggle, including a bloody mattress that was flipped over. There was also large amounts of blood in various parts of the home, which led them to believe that she'd been taken by force. Her car keys, purse, and money were all found at the house. The authorities and family members searched for Gould for days, until on the 27th of September 2004, her lifeless body was found at the bottom of a 35-foot embankment off Arkansas State Highway 9, about 5 miles from Melbourne. She suffered blunt force trauma from one or more blows to the head. The authorities pursued clues and interviewed multiple people in connection to the case. Last year, a billboard was put up in Melbourne City offering a $25,000 reward for any information that will lead to an arrest and conviction in Gould's case. A couple of investigators who knew and worked with Rebekah's family started up a Facebook group in honour of Rebekah Gould in the hopes of getting some tips from the public about the senseless attack. Recently, a 44-year-old man named William Miller became a member of the group and started commenting about the case. He showed an interest and offered suggestions like maybe the attacker wore gloves or other stuff that seemed odd and raised suspicions. It was thought that he made these comments to keep tabs on what the investigators knew. Behavioural clues of the attacker included removing Rebekah's body from the location of the primary scene and placing it elsewhere, and then attempting to clean up the crime scene. Miller lived in Texas and was visiting Izard County when Rebekah's life was taken. He moved to Cottage Grove, Oregon afterward and stayed in the Philippines for an extended period of time. Miller only became a suspect just a few months ago and had only just recently come back to the States to Oregon to live. An Arkansas police officer, armed with that information, flew out there and interviewed him. Over the course of the interview, the officer developed enough information to make an arrest on the night of the 7th of November 2020. The authorities were tight-lipped about the case and would not discuss a possible motive of the crime at this early stage of the arrest. Rebekah's father, Larry Gould, said, "She was a truly beautiful spirit. She was filled with love and kindness. She had a huge heart, and she'll do anything for anybody at any time." On the evening of the 3rd of September 1990, an 81-year-old woman named Kathryn Crigler had her leg recently removed from an operation and got around in a wheelchair. She lived in a tidy little house on busy Highway 182 in the college town of Starkville, Mississippi. As she was recovering from the surgery, her church friend, 65-year-old Betty Jones, was staying with her as a caregiver. Both were widowed and looked out for one another. As they were relaxing, Kathryn was getting ready to settle down in bed for the night, and a knock came at the door. Betty answered the door, and as she did so, she was confronted by a tall man who was a complete stranger. He immediately pushed his way into the home, and she tried to fend him off. As she did, the man pulled out a knife and slit her throat, and Jones's life drained away as she fell to the floor. With blood all over his hands, the man rushed to the rear of the house and knocked Kathryn from her wheelchair and beat her by breaking several bones and then violated her. After the attacker finished with her, he fled the scene with $28 and locked the doors behind him. Kathryn gathered herself and crawled into the kitchen and pulled a rotary phone off the wall and dialed 911. She then explained to the operator the horror that transpired. When officers arrived, they had to break a window to get into the home. Kathryn was admitted to hospital and an assault kit was used to extract the attacker's DNA from her body. While she was there, she learned of Betty's fate and she felt responsible for what happened to her and suffered from deep depression. On the 11th of November 1990, while staying in a nursing home, Kathryn succumbed to complications from her injuries and passed away. The authorities theorised at the time that the intruder knew his victims, and they were targeted specifically because they were two vulnerable women. Police tried interviewing suspects, but no new leads were generated, and the case went cold. In 2004, a Starkville detective named Bill Lott was assigned the case, and discovered that Kathryn's assault kit evidence had been preserved. Forensic technicians used the DNA and ran the results through the CODIS DNA databases, but there wasn't a hit. In June of 2018, with advances in DNA technology, Parabon was hired to develop a suspect from the DNA. In August of 2018, using forensic genetic genealogy, the DNA was narrowed down to suspect 51-year-old Michael Wayne DeVaughn. Parabon was also able to construct two composite images, both past and present from the DNA, giving an idea what the suspect looked like. Michael was a twice divorced father of 3. He worked in construction and farming most of his life. He was being held in the Iuka, Mississippi jail on illicit substance charges. A lot believed that DeVaughn had similar features to the ones depicted in the Parabon composite, but he needed to make sure he had the right man. A cigarette butt that DeVaughn discarded while in custody was sent to a lab for DNA testing in early October 2018. Within a few days, the DNA on the cigarette was a match to the DNA taken from Kathryn Crigler, linking him to the scene of the crime. On the 6th of October 2018, he was transferred from Iuka to Starkville, Mississippi prison. He was charged for taking Betty Jones's life and indecent assault and battery of Kathryn Crigler. On the 17th of November 2020, in the Lowndes County courtroom, DeVaughn pleaded guilty to the charges and was sentenced to life in jail without parole. On the night of the 25th of September 1992, a woman was cleaning the offices at a cemetery called the Lafayette Memorial Park, located along Ramsey Street in Fayetteville in North Carolina. While walking back to her car, she lifted a vacuum cleaner into it, and when she was suddenly ambushed and struck unconscious from behind, she was driven to Harnett County, where she woke up in the trunk of the car. 3 men proceeded to take her into a wooded area, where she continued to get beaten, then violated, and left clinging to her life from the injuries she sustained. Her vehicle was later found at the cemetery, where the suspect spray-painted the words 3 horsemen across the hood and dumped the car in a duck pond. Investigators at the time said the victim was beaten worse than anyone they had ever seen. Evidence was collected at the crime scene and DNA from the victim herself, using a kit that was entered into the CODIS DNA database, and a profile of the suspect was created, but no new leads were developed and the case went cold. The case was reopened in 2015 by a newly created cold case team from government-granted funds, but the matter continued to be unresolved. That was until investigators got a break in the case in September of 2020, when 46-year-old Roy Junior Proctor of Fayetteville submitted a DNA sample, which was forwarded to a crime lab as part of a probation requirement when he was charged for another crime he committed in 2019. In October 2020, it was discovered with the help of genetic genealogy that the DNA taken from Proctor matched the crime scene from the 1992 brutal attack. The investigators tracked down Proctor and he was arrested at 8 AM on the 16th of November 2020 while at work at Smithfield Packaging in Tar Heel, Fayetteville. He has been charged with indecent assault, kidnapping, theft of a motor vehicle, and attempting to take the victim's life. The investigation also showed that he'd been living in the area all this time. The arrest will help the investigators track down the other 2 offenders responsible for the heinous crime. Proctor has been held at the Cumberland County Detention Center, with bail set at just over $1 million, with his first court appearance due on the 18th of November 2020. He could have been identified in this case in 2013 during an unrelated domestic violence arrest, but the law didn't require the DNA to be taken back then for this type of offence. The victim became an advocate for women who have been assaulted and is pushing for new legislation to be passed that allows DNA samples to be taken from individuals who have been convicted of domestic violence. After learning of the news of the arrest by the authorities, the victim was relieved and said, "This is the beginning of the last chapter of the story for me." On the 26th of April 1995, 2 hunters made a horrifying discovery when they stumbled across a lifeless body of a man in a wooded area on George Russell Road in Decatur, in Alabama. He had passed away due to a gunshot wound to the head. Investigators were alerted and moved in. The man was identified as Christopher Alvin Daly, and evidence was collected from the crime scene. His vehicle was later found partially submerged in the Tennessee River. Despite an extensive investigation, a suspect was never developed in the case. In the years that followed, the case was revisited several times in search for leads, but the case went cold. On the 18th of November 2020, Decatur police received a phone call from a man wishing to confess to the slaying. He later met up with the detectives and agreed to show the police the crime scene and completed a reenactment. The information he provided matched the evidence in the case. He was identified as 53-year-old Johnny Whitehead, who'd been charged with taking Daly's life. He's been held in the Morgan County Jail, with bail set at $15,000. Just 3 weeks after he took Daly's life, he was arrested for selling illicit substances and a string of other indictable offences. The motive of the attack has not yet been revealed, and the case is in its early stage of arrest and investigation. The authorities informed Daly's surviving family members of the arrest and hope it brings them some form of closure in the case.